If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense Report.
Hear ye, come one, come all. You're listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel Nikoloff and Darnell Samuels.
Darnell, man, we're blessed, bro. We're blessed.
Why do you say that?
Well, we just, some great guests coming on our show. What can I say?
Yes, this is true. We have David Koyzis, author of Political Visions and Illusions, here with us as a guest on our show today. So welcome, David.
Well, thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here.
Yeah. Oh, wait, can we call you David or is it?
Oh,
Doctor,
David is fine. David is fine.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
yes.
Okay. So, for our listeners who don't know who you are, can you give a background on yourself?
Yes, certainly. I'm an academic political scientist. I taught political science for 30 years at a Christian university here in Canada, and I am originally from the States. I was born not far from Chicago, but I've lived in Canada for about a third of a century now. So I'm a Canadian citizen. I feel quite thoroughly at home in this country now. It's an adopted country, to be sure. My primary affiliation right now is with an organization called Global Scholars Canada, and I've been a member of that group for about a year now, and I'm launching a fundraising campaign to support my work, and if anybody would like to be on my list of potential supporters, even if you can only support me with your prayers, then I would be very happy to have you, to inform you of what I'm doing on a regular basis. The book started because my first year of teaching, I was given the responsibility of teaching a course on political ideologies. This was back before the internet. You had to go through these orange hardbound volumes called books in print, and there were lots of these volumes. Every year they would come out, and you had to look to find textbooks in there. I couldn't find a textbook that did what I thought needed to be done in such a course at a Christian university. So eventually, around 1994, I started making initial notes towards writing a book, and the first edition was published in 2003 by InterVarsity Press. It sold steadily, which I was very happy about. And then in 2017, I proposed a second edition of the book, and that was published about a year and a half ago. It was endorsed to my great surprise, I suppose, but also gratitude by Tim Keller, who's a well-known Reformed minister, the Presbyterian Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Manhattan, in New York.
Yes.
And then it quickly sold out and is now in its third printing. So I'm very, very grateful for that. And since the pandemic hit, I've had all sorts of opportunities to speak, almost entirely online.
Okay. Yeah. Well, of course.
It changes everything, right?
It does. It opened up new opportunities for me that I could hardly have imagined a few months earlier.
Right. I know. And see, we found out about you through the TGC article through Bruce Ashford.
Good friend, yes.
And yes. And so when it came into my feed, I thought it was fascinating because, well, the title alone, and I think the title was the Canadian. Hold on, it is.
I got it. The intellectual in Canada who unmasked political idolatry in America.
Right. That's right. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So that's what came into my feed, and I was just like, oh, okay, this is definitely aligns with the Sixth Sense brand and the things that we talk about. So I read it, was really good, and so I said, okay, let me go get this book. So I went out and I purchased the book. I have the second edition. Actually has a really nice glossy kind of finish.
It's very nice. Yeah, I like it. The first edition, the cover was a little bit busy, but this one is very sleek. It looks like the opening sequence to Vertigo, the Hitchcock film. That's what.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And it feels really nice. I was like, oh, okay. All right. Yeah, this should be fun. And so, reading it, I the first thing that stuck out to me was your argument about how, as Christians, these political ideologies can become idolatry. And so, we're hot off, fresh off the U.S. election. And so, Christians have been asking, and we did an episode prior about, the U.S. elections and
one issue voting.
One issue voting. And so, can you kind of just touch on the book in regards to your argument in regards to idolatry and ideology?
Yeah, and I think I can start with idolatry because when we read about idols in the Old Testament, for example, we read about pagan peoples and also the people of Israel as well, copying their neighbors, who fashioned gods out of wood and stone and various other materials. Now, in so doing, that in no way made wood a bad thing or stone a bad thing. It's in other words, the things that people idolize are not in themselves bad, and generally they're good. You have to have individual freedom, for example. This is something that liberalism champions. Conservatism talks about tradition. You can't live a human life without tradition, because most of who we are, we're more like our parents than we're unlike them, even if we may rebel against them in our youth or whatever. Socialism, common ownership. We already have common ownership in our society. We have multiple subjects of ownership in our society, corresponding to the diversity of various social forms that we have in Canada, the United States, virtually anywhere in the world nowadays. And so idolatry is taking something that's good, taking something within God's creation and elevating it in our hearts to the position of God Himself. And that's what makes for an idol. Most of our idols are much more subtle than the ones that the ancient Israelites were tempted to follow, to worship. Maybe it's material success. Maybe it's good sex. Maybe it's pleasures in life. All of these things are good, but they're not God. And if we have a disproportionate love for these things, and if other things take a back seat to these things, then we know that we're in the realm of idolatry. And I think that's true of the major political ideologies that that have dominated the Western world for the last, maybe 200 some years.
Yes, no, and we could definitely see how polarized not just U.S. politics have been, but also Canadian as well. And so. Yeah, but this is good. And I think this will be helpful for our listeners to not shy away from the discussion of church and state and so forth. So the article opened up some other channels for us in regards to how other channels in regards to your research. And one of the things we came across was a lecture you did on how liberty can be
libertarianism suppresses liberty.
So in the realm of libertarianism suppressing liberty, that to me that sounds like oxymoron.
Yes, it would to most people, I think. Yeah.
So can you unpack that idea?
Yeah, certainly. Under libertarianism is really a form of liberalism. It's an early form of liberalism. If you followed my argument in Chapter 2 of Political Visions and Illusions, you may remember that I talked about 5 stages in the development of liberalism, beginning with the Hobbesian Commonwealth, and the Hobbesian refers to the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century. The night watchman state, the regulatory state, the equal opportunity state, and then what I've called the choice enhancement state, which is the latest stage in the development of liberalism since maybe about 1960. And so libertarianism really tries to shift the clock back to the night watchman state, in which the state becomes very small. At least ideally that's supposed to be the case. It refrains very largely from interfering in economic life, especially in the operations of the free market, and the expectation is that somehow the state will remain as small as it possibly can. It can be. It's a limited state in which individuals have a very large latitude for their activities, economic and otherwise.
Mm-hmm. And I think I was listening to the lecture on that, and I think to some extent you drew, if I'm remembering correctly, you drew a little bit of parallel with, the idea that as Christians coming under God, we to some extent need the guardrails to actually have more liberty.
Yeah, that's right, and that's something that I think probably the most astute philosophers have understood down through the years that liberty is not just the right to do whatever we please, and unfortunately, that's the way that liberty has been defined in our society, at least for the last maybe 50 or 60 years, but I think it has roots even before that. So the right to do something, the idea that somehow we can shape the world to conform to our own desires, and that means that somehow we can shape the people around us to conform to our own desires as well. And if we have to use the state to persuade these people to go along with that, then so be it. So there was a man by the name of Patrick Deneen at University of Notre Dame, which is my alma mater, and he wrote a book a couple of years ago called "Why Liberalism Failed," and it's a brilliant book because he really shows that the both sides of liberalism, whether it's the statist variety or the libertarian variety, both lead in the direction ultimately of the omnicompetent state. And if we take seriously liberalism's view that the state is a kind of contract that's formed by sovereign individuals, then if those sovereign individuals change their minds, if they prefer to have a limited state, then so be it. But if those sovereign individuals say, well, we want the state not simply to be limited, but we want the state to advance our liberties, to advance our choices, to expand the options that we have to be able to choose in life. That would take a very large state to be able to do that. And that explains the current states that we're in, the choice enhancement state, and the idea that we should all have as many options as possible in life. And if we don't, then somehow our liberties are being violated. We're being oppressed in some fashion. Whereas prior to 1960, maybe it's the post-World War II era, the idea that we would all have the same options or equal options would have been virtually unthinkable because the world isn't built like that. There are constraints, there are real constraints, there are natural constraints, there are social constraints, there are political constraints, the economic constraints of all sorts.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a fact of life.
There's a quote I have from the book on page 53 on liberalism, and you say, and you basically summarize it like this: the irony, as Patrick Deneen points out, is that the more completely the sphere of autonomy is secured, the more comprehensive the state must become. And to me, it sounded like you were saying that ultimately this political view creates the problem it's trying to solve. Liberty over authority.
Yeah, that's right. Because liberalism takes one side of the equation. They take the individual, whereas in reality, individuals do not exist by themselves. And when we do get together, it's not always because we have chosen to get together. For example, in the Ten Commandments, we read that we are to honor our parents who have brought us into the world. There's probably no relationship besides family that is less amenable to the liberal or the libertarian worldview. because we do not choose our families. We are born within a particular birth family, and that's but nevertheless we have obligations. My father died in August. He was 92 years old, and since that time I'm taking every day I take out at least a few minutes to call my mother and talk to her via FaceTime, because I believe that as a son, that's my responsibility. I'm not living close to her. She's living with one of my sisters right now, but I believe that as a son, it's my responsibility. I did not choose my mother. I did not choose my father. I did not choose my siblings, but nevertheless, I am responsible to some degree to my birth family, as well as to the family that I started with my wife.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like with regards to the libertarianism, liberalism, I wonder to some extent, like when you talk about the 5 states of liberalism, and you get into choice enhancement state, I sort of see a bit of the progressivism, playing a role there, because I think about some of the roots of libertarianism and liberalism being about negative rights, and so much has become about positive rights. And I think from my perspective, the positive rights stuff is well beyond any sort of libertarian view.
That's right. Yes.
And so,
yeah, I believe. No, I believe that's true. But I think if we view the individual as sovereign, which is what liberalism does, then the seeds of the choice enhancement state, I think, are there from the very beginning. Now at the beginning, liberalism was moderated by older points of view, even in somebody like John Locke, the 17th century philosopher who was so influential on Thomas Jefferson when he wrote his Declaration of Independence in 1776. Even in somebody like John Locke, we see the beginnings of what might be called the choice enhancement state. So for Locke, the state is a product of a contract, but he also very strongly hints that marriage is a mere contract that can be dissolved at least once the children are out of the home and fending for themselves.
Oh, sorry. He was arguing that marriage can be dissolved.
It can be.
Once
yes, that's right. Yes, very strongly
was removed.
Yeah, over the children has ended, and so the idea of trying to take every human community or relationship and trying to make of it a kind of exchange relationship, almost like a market relationship, is very tempting to modern libertarians. People like Hayek. People like perhaps Ludwig von Mises, to try to make as many of these relationships similar to market relationships as possible. And if you try to stretch it so that the only reason that one should hamper somebody's right to do something, or to entrench on somebody's right to do something is if they try to harm somebody else. That is not a principle that can be taken very far, at least in very many communities. So, for example, the institutional church, if you're a member of a church, now then that means that at least in principle, you are under that church congregation's discipline. And if you do something that egregiously violates biblical norms, you can expect to fall under the discipline of the
elders,
session, or the elders, the consistory, whatever they would call it, the council. You would fall under the discipline. So a church membership is not predicated on the notion that you can do anything you want as long as you don't harm other church members. So the very principle, the principle that we can trace back to John Stuart Mill, that the only reason why individual liberty should be limited is to prevent harm to others, that is not something that can be applicable to very many communities. You might be able to do that at least for a time with the state, but because liberal ideology tends to be totalistic, is not going to be patient for very long with communities that have tighter standards of membership than the state will allow.
Well, and I would say the one thing, like from the libertarian perspective, it doesn't prevent voluntary submission to additional contracts, right? And so you could argue the membership is a contract. And so, like, because if you determine, well, you were going to punish me in a way that I don't want, well, exclusion is the solution. You sort of dissolve the contract. So I definitely see the point you're trying to make, because of course, like, you know, there becomes more. And I think to some extent, like, there's a quote that I think sort of applies that I say a lot. It's like, within my own family, I'm a socialist. Within my community, I'm a I'm a liberal. Within my city, I'm a conservative. Within my province, I'm a libertarian, and within my country, I'm an anarchist. And the idea being, just being like, you know, why should someone in BC have any influence on how I live here? Right. But those that are closer to me, I want to have influence on them, and they have influence on me because I know they have my interest, that they can actually see my interest.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and see, I think you're expressing in a way that I probably wouldn't assent to completely, but I think you're expressing something that I bring out in the latter chapters of my book. You know, as to the what I call the pluriformity of communities in which we find ourselves, and that different standards apply within each of those communities. Mm-hmm. So yes, you know, in the family, there's a common refrigerator, a common cupboard that everybody takes from, you know, as they have needs.
Common bank account.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yeah. So and you know, so in a very small community, you can have something like common ownership of property being taken to a very large, to a very wide extent. But the larger a community becomes, it becomes more difficult to have a wide latitude of common ownership. So, you know, to try to take a principle that's applicable to the family and apply it to a country that's maybe 100 million people, that simply isn't going to work.
Now, as it relates to the article by Bruce Ashford, he mentions your views on being a conservative and how, one moment, I'll get the quote here. 1 second. Okay. Yeah. So in the article, Bruce Ashford says, you said this about being a conservative. Yet, as Koyzis notes, conservatism isn't a single, stable, or unified ideology we can encapsulate in an identifiable doctrinal position. It doesn't even qualify strictly as an ideology, since it tends to feed off of other ideologies. Its tendency is to conserve, and usually it seeks to conserve a particular era in a nation's cultural heritage. Conservatism tends to deify a certain era in national life and ascribe evil to grand social reform agendas.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's Bruce's way of expressing my argument, and I mean, some people will say that conservatism is not an ideology at all, and you know, I think if the good to be found in conservatism is that it very sensibly counsels caution. You know, don't upend the whole apple cart, if you will, in the interest of reform. So, you know, as a kind of counsel of caution, I think conservatives have a valuable role to play. I think they make a genuine contribution. It's when we start probing them a little bit more carefully that we'll find a lot of variation. You know, so they'll say, well, let's be careful what we're doing. But then if you ask them, well, where do you want to go? Where do you want to go? What do you want to do? Then they will not be able to tell you, or they may tell you, but different conservatives will tell you different things. So in that respect, conservatism is it cannot be reduced to a particular set of principles, because those principles are going to change depending on whom we're talking to. So, you know, the first thing I used to tell my students, the first thing that you tell somebody who claims to be a conservative is, what is it that you're trying to conserve? And different conservatives are going to give you different answers to that question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, I was going to say that that point, especially in your book, that's the point that changed my perspective on how I use the word conservative and conservatism. And so, like, I guess because I'm reformed in my theology and we have a tight exegesis, right? So we're very stringent on how the scriptures are handled, and it's kind of a conservative approach, right? Right. So if it's not in the text, sola scriptura. If it's not in the text, we're not messing with it. Right. So, that's the school of thought I'm coming from. And so it starts to flow into other aspects, into my economics and my political thought and so forth. But the way how this is changed my mind on how I use this term and how I apply it to myself is, you made an argument about at some point, like, to get to being a conservative, you have to be progressive. There was a stage of being a progressive to get to be conservative. So of course, in the argument I think you used was the reformers. The reformers had to be progressive. They had to be progressive to get to be conservative by opposing the Catholic Church and starting the Reformation. And I was just like, I was like, he's right. No, I'm finished. Yeah. So now, thanks to you, David, I'm like, okay, using that term, I'm very skeptical, and I kind of push away from it. So I don't go by that title anymore. So thank you. Yeah. Thank you for freeing me.
You're very welcome. Yes. Yeah, Koyzis the Liberator.
Koyzis the Liberator. That's good.
Yeah. Maybe I'll adopt it as my moniker. I'll put it in my email signatures.
It was big. And yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's a couple of quotes that I've heard that or things that resonate really well with it. One is, there's a quote from a guy that says, "Conservatism is progressivism wearing seatbelts." And the other thing was, we did an episode on a book called The Three Language of Politics, and he says the conservatism sort of axis is between civility and barbarism. And I thought it resonates really well with, to some extent, what you're saying, because they're trying to conserve, because any sort of change is like deemed as like you're trending toward barbarism, you're trending toward disorder, and you're ruining, uplifting or flipping over the apple cart of civility that we currently have.
Right. Yeah, and in reality, I mean, we are always at once progressing and conserving. Even people who call themselves progressives, with no qualification whatsoever, are still there are still many things they want to conserve, even if they're not admitting it. Democratic forms of government, parliamentary debate, rather than people throwing eggs at each other or what have you. They even within they are presupposing a whole edifice of civilization that has come before them. So even progressives don't want to abandon that, but they differ with the conservatives as to what should be abandoned and what should be preserved. But unfortunately, conservatives and professed progressives do not really have clear criteria by which to judge what to conserve and what to progress to. And this is why I think that whole progressive conservative, I don't want to talk about the Progressive Conservative Party, if you will, but the progressive/conservative controversy, if you will, the age-old fight. It's really it's sterile. It cannot really go anywhere. It's not going to. It may be kind of a cover for a kind of thoughtlessness or mere pragmatism that is not aware, not conscious of first principles that are governing our activities in the political realm or elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No, and I guess for me, like, it's helpful because you see it in all areas of life, how we go from revolution to being conservative and just the natural flow of life, how things progress. Now, of course, there are things we should fight for to preserve. There are some truths and values and principles that we should try to preserve. But I think it's important to, like you said, ask the question: what exactly are we trying to preserve? Right? When does life start? An abortion, right? The sanctity of life. That's important to preserve, and so forth, from a Christian conviction. So yeah, that was really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, and then we need to have some principles to decide what do we conserve and what do we abandon. And conservatism itself won't give you those principles.
Right.
You have to look elsewhere to find them.
Yes. And that's why, and of course everybody's listening, they're like, oh, what? So what? Darnell's not reformed anymore? Hey, man, I'm still reformed in my theology.
Okay.
It's just that when it comes to my politics and my economics, I got to do a lot more listening and less talking.
So on a previous episode, I think it was the 3 languages one, I made the point that I feel like Christians sort of just found themselves in the conservative camp because of sort of what you're saying. There's no real identifiable doctrines or ideas, but because of where, America and North America sort of came from, the last couple hundred years of trajectory, and Christianity sort of being the norm or the social popular approach or way of life.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that, or do you see that the Christian conservative alignment has some other rationale to it?
Well, it's there is a sense in which Christians are traditionalists, and I'm going to use that in a broad sense of accepting what has been handed down to us. So insofar, if you're Catholic or Orthodox, you would believe that there's some kind of a great tradition, maybe partially written, partially oral, that's being handed down through the last 2 millennia to modern Christians. If you're on the Reformed side, you're more likely to talk about the Bible as being our ultimate authority for faith and life. And that's something that's handed down to us. When we read the Bible, we are reading a collection of very ancient documents, diverse literatures, but we believe that there's a central story that's holding it all together. That in itself is a kind of conservative sensibility, because we are assuming that this very ancient document, that known as the Holy Scriptures, contain something that we need to follow. So there's a kind of instinct that grows out of that.
Yes.
But of course, traditions are going to vary tremendously. In the American South, prior to the 1960s, huge numbers of Christians, Southern Baptists, Southern Methodists, Southern Presbyterians, and the like, who nevertheless accepted racial segregation and would not want to have an African American in their churches. Well, where did that come from? They were deferring to a tradition of racial segregation that went back to slavery prior to 1865 and to the bringing of the first slaves to America in 1619. That was an old tradition which they had not evaluated in a spiritually discerning way.
Yes, and because Joel was referencing an episode we did on the 3 languages of politics, talking across the political divide, which was by Arnold Kling. I'm not sure if you've heard of the book, and so the book was arguing that there isn't a particular each of the 3 particular views of being progressive, conservative, and libertarian. Each one has a value. Each one has a value, a virtue to each of them, and so that's why we shouldn't be so close-fisted. But what I love about your book is that now it starts to say, okay, well, let's not talk about the virtues. Let's talk about the vices and how these political ideas can become vices. And I was just like, "Ooh, okay, this is a flip side, and this is a conversation that needs to be had in light of the U.S. election that we just saw." Yeah, so this was really good.
If you had a deep reading of my book, you'll also note that I also admit that the ideologies are right about one particular thing.
Right.
And it's so it's not just talking about vices, it's talking about virtues. But I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said that that our age, speaking about the early 20th century, is not devoid of virtues. It's taken one virtue and it's made everything out of it. It run roughshod over everything else, is the way that Chesterton put it. And in a sense, I think that's what I'm trying to do in my book as well, to recognize. I don't use the language of virtues, but I do use the language of creation order, if you will. Something in creation they genuinely see as being of value, but they esteem it too highly, and that's where they start to move into the realm of idolatry.
Okay.
So as you're reading it, recognize that each of these ideologies has something genuine to offer. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
So you say that. So now we have to move on. Now we have to talk about socialism, and you can talk about the virtues of socialism.
Right. Of course.
So you had a discussion you did on YouTube called the how socialism suppresses society, and in it you made some remarks saying that it's hostility to property, and nonetheless all variations of socialism have in common an impulse toward coercing society toward material equality and communal property ownership. Although these factors are economic, they can't be realized without the exertion of political force. So can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I can just back up a moment and indicate that when I was about maybe 20 years old, I regarded myself as a socialist. That was something that I had was briefly captivated by it, because it seemed to be, if you look at social democratic parties in Germany and Scandinavian countries and so forth, it seemed as though people were fairly comfortable there. There wasn't a lot of poverty and the like, and it seemed to be that was the way to go. I didn't stay in that camp for very long, as it turned out, because I was at that point I was looking a little bit more deeply than just a kind of economic system, if you will, because socialism is more than just an economic system. In the same way you can say that liberalism is more than a political system. You have to dig down into the heart. There's much going on that deep spiritual level within the ideologies and the followers of these ideologies. So socialism, I do not believe that it's wrong to champion communal ownership of property. I visited a group not too far from Cambridge called the Brethren of Early Christianity that is characterized by a wide range of common ownership. It's a kind of communal. It's a kind of a Hutterite-inspired community in southern Ontario. And very impressed with what they were doing there, but a lot of the people are related to each other. There are families, whole families that are part of that. Once you start getting into a larger community, the area of life that can be communally centered is going to shrink necessarily. So in a country like the Soviet Union, where they attempted to bring about communal ownership of property on a vast scale, it did not work because people did not know each other. The levels of trust outside of family networks were very weak, at least in many parts of the Russian Empire. So when there was an attempt to try to implement socialism, it ended up foundering, and after 70 years, it pretty much ran out of steam, and it couldn't continue to function in that same way. Now, what socialists neglect to recognize is that we already have communal ownership of property in our societies. But we have a variety of communities that can be said to own property. So the family home, my wife and daughter and I are owners of our home. It belongs to us. It's the subject of communal ownership. It doesn't just belong to me. I'm not an ancient Roman patriarch who's wielding that owns everybody and everything that's in. No, there's a family, and the family can be said to own this home. The same if you could talk about a university, maybe Tyndale University in Toronto. They own property. It's a corporate kind of ownership of property. If you go to the Ford plant, just where the 403 branches off from the Queen Elizabeth Way in is that Oakville, I think it is. That property is owned by the Ford Motor Company. So there are a variety of communities that own property. What socialists want to try to do is to try to eliminate all those and consolidate those into one single subject of ownership, which they label the community with a capital C. And so, you know, when I came to recognize that in my younger years, I recognized, oh, wait a minute, socialists are not trying to bring about our, you know, to replace individual ownership with communal ownership. But basically what we already have is a kind of mix. And this is something that Aristotle already recognized 2,500 years ago. Economists, Joel, you're the economist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, that's right. So you know, we call it a mixed economy. So in Canada, we have crown corporations, but crown corporations are not the whole of our economy. We have private enterprise, we have small businesses, we have family-run businesses, we have you know, large corporations. We do have crown corporations. We have government departments and so forth. We have national, provincial, and municipal parks that are operated by our various levels of government on behalf of the citizens as a whole. So we have diverse economies, diverse polities in that sense. The socialism wants to try to eliminate all that complexity and to try to compress all of that into a single communal form.
Economics, there's this term called tragedy of the commons.
Exactly.
And things like, you know, even just let's use a park, which is a relatively sort of simple, commonly owned, you know, property. The tragedy of the commons is that people consume the product more than they actually put back into it, and so you deteriorate the product over time. And so I think this is sort of what you get as you see that scaling out. To your point, like the bigger the community that they try to put this across, that problem becomes compounded because there's nobody to custodian the asset. And you know, I think, you know, giving a little bit of pushback, I would say the scenarios you described with like a corporation or different scenarios, those are to some extent voluntary, and the ability to leave and be compensated exists.
Yes, that's right.
And so those scenarios, I think the tragedy of the commons is more so not occurring, but maybe there's a bad manager that you've hired, and that's a different problem. Right.
Yeah, so what that means is that for common property that's genuinely common to large numbers of citizens, such as parklands and so forth, or pasture lands, if you're talking about a small village, you know, that some person or some group needs to be given responsibility over the commons. You know, so you can't just have a kind of anarchic, you know, everybody's going to be responsible, we'll all put it. You have to have schedules. If you go to university and you're living with a whole series of other students and you have a common living space, you'll probably put a schedule as to who's going to clean the kitchen, who's going to clean the bathrooms, you know, things like that. You have to have an actual person or a group of people that are going to take responsibility for that. And the larger such a thing becomes, the more that particular group will have to exercise a certain amount of coercion in order to keep people, you know, fulfilling their duties, their responsibilities on a regular basis. And of course, in the Soviet Union, you know, people did not necessarily work very hard for these communal farms or state farms or you know, these state corporations, state factories, and so forth. And they said, well, you know, there were jokes, these kind of gallows humor that Russians would come up with, and they said, well, you know, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. Is the way they put it. Yeah. You know, so it's not being paid in hard currency at that time because the ruble was not exchangeable on the open market, you know. So they say, well, they pretend to pay us, we pretend to work, and that's typically what's going to happen in that kind of a society.
Yeah, no. And now Bruce Ashford was talking about Christian solutions and how we can better do better political involvement. And so one of the things he was talking about, and you talk about in your book as well, the principle of subsidiarity, affirming civil society and sphere sovereignty. We did an episode on sphere sovereignty.
Oh, great!
With Joe Boot.
Oh yes, that's right.
Yes. We did that with Joe Boot.
Okay.
That episode was well received.
Great.
Because these were kind of new ideas to our listeners. And so he goes on to say about you, Bruce Ashford. He says that as Koyzis does in the last several chapters of Political Visions and Illusions, we should work together to construct a non-ideological alternative for Christians who wish to recognize God's sovereignty over the nation and draw upon our Christianity to work for the common good.
That's right. Yes.
Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think we need to be careful because in using that, I'm not simply talking about transforming society. I'm talking about recognizing the realities of our society as they currently exist. Doesn't mean that reform is off the table. No, but whether we're talking about conserving or reforming, which I think have to go together in some fashion, then we need to be aware that our societies are diverse. There's a diversity of structures. I have this term that I use called societal pluriformity, or the pluriformity of authorities, as I expressed it in my second book, We Answer to Another. The pluriformity of authorities, it means that that we are embedded in a variety of communities. And we're not just individuals, floating individuals, entering into market relations or contractual relations with people, but we are embedded in a whole variety of communities. And that's for the better. It's for the best. It means that if we talk about our calling as Christians, some people think, especially young people, if I talk to them about their callings, they think I'm talking about their careers, about their work life. That's only a small part of our total calling as those who are created in God's image. So my calling as a human being is as an author. At one time it was as a teacher. I'm still doing teaching, but mostly it's online and is taking place around the world now. I'm a husband to my wife. That's a calling. I'm a father to my daughter. That is a calling. I'm a son to my elderly mother. That's a calling. I'm a member of my church, and I have a calling with respect to my church congregation as well. So in what might be called a mature, differentiated society, we recognize that no one institution has the final say. Let me repeat that again, because I think that's very important. No one institution has the final say. Now, we sometimes think that, well, maybe the state does, maybe government does, but it doesn't, only within its particular sphere. Now, right now, with this pandemic, we're in something of an extraordinary period of time, because governments are taking measures that they would not otherwise take if there were not some kind of an emergency. So during the two world wars, governments took emergency powers that they could not have taken during peacetime. And that's basically the way that it has to be. Right now, governments are imposing quarantines, lockdowns, and so forth, and that's to try to keep the public safe. Once the emergency is passed, if government tries to hold on to those powers, then we know that something is amiss. Then we know that it's going too far.
Mm-hmm. And I think some people would claim that we're in that place now, but
some people do claim that, yes. That it is a different conversation, yes.
Yes. Now, you use the term subsidiarity, and you define it as this in your book. Subsidiarity thus means that tasks are to be fulfilled by the lowest element in social hierarchy, and only when this proves impossible is a higher community, such as the state, justified in stepping in and offering assistance. Once matters are set right, however, the higher community must then withdraw. Subsidiarity was deemed important for the maintaining a healthy social order in which all parts may retain their vitality and initiative over against the threat of an omnipotent or omnicompetent state.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And let me say a few words about subsidiarity, because it's a term that comes out of Catholic social teachings, beginning especially with Pope Leo XIII, who was on the papal throne between 1878 and I believe it was 1902 or 1903, and he produced a body of papal encyclicals. These are pastoral letters that are published by the popes down through the centuries, and if taken together, they form a body of what is come to be called Catholic social teachings, drawing on the traditions of the Church, drawing on Thomas Aquinas, to some degree Aristotle, going back 2,500 years ago, and it presupposes a hierarchical notion of society. So with God at the top, there's the institutional church. Underneath God, there is the state. But below the state, you have certain intermediary communities or mediating structures. Below that, you have individuals. And so in that kind of a hierarchical arrangement, subsidiarity is meant to try to defend the lower levels against the higher levels interfering too much in their lives. So subsidiarity is something that was tailor-made for Catholic social principles. Now, do you want me to talk about sphere sovereignty? Because that presupposes a somewhat different different social ontology, if you will. But
yes, please.
Yeah, okay. So sphere sovereignty, going back to Abraham Kuyper. Abraham Kuyper was the Dutch polymath. He was an academic. He was a pastor. He was a university administrator. He was prime minister of the Netherlands between 1901 and 1905. He was born in 1837 and died in 1920, just 100 years ago, this month, I believe. And he came up with this notion of, in Dutch, it's soevereiniteit in eigen kring, or sovereignty in its own sphere, often and somewhat terribly inelegantly shortened to sphere sovereignty. It's not a term that speaks to English speakers in any way, but it presupposes a less hierarchical social ontology. So the idea is that all of these communities in which we find ourselves embedded, and also we as individuals, relate directly to God, receiving our authority directly from God himself. And God has delegated a certain degree of his authority to all of these agents that we find in society. So to schools, to states, to church congregations, to families, to marriages, to indeed to individuals, to a whole variety of other kinds of communities, business enterprises, labor unions, and the like, which have an important role to play, all of which have important roles to play in a smoothly functioning society. And so sphere sovereignty, it doesn't mean that there are hard and fast walls between the different spheres of society, because in reality they are all mixed together in some way, and each of us as an individual is involved in a variety of overlapping communities. But it does mean that a business enterprise should be following the creational structure for a business enterprise, and that's to provide a service to the public in exchange for fair compensation, usually determined by some kind of value that's determined in the market. A school has a task to educate children. Government has the responsibility to do public justice, and public justice doesn't mean the government does everything. It means that that itself, if government becomes totalitarian, then it's egregiously violating justice. And so under this notion of sphere sovereignty, government recognizes that all of these other communities have their legitimate spheres of authority that governing authorities ought not to interfere with under most circumstances.
So what about like in instances where the church, their sphere of sovereignty might sometimes overlap with the political sphere of sovereignty of the state?
Okay, what are you thinking of in particular?
In your book, you say that, in other words, in contrast to the subsidiarity functionaries of the institutional church would not intervene in an ostensibly subordinate institution and set matters aright from without. The political problem would be addressed precisely politically, and its solution would come from within the body politic, which was acknowledged to stand directly and immediately under God's sovereignty.
Right. Yeah. I don't remember the exact context in which I
I was talking about Calvin, and Calvin himself was far from approving such action and talking about.
That's what I thought.
Calvin, and the state.
Yeah, it has to do. The point that I was making there is that to keep the state in line, there has to be some kind of constitutional governance. And by constitutional, I don't mean necessarily a written document. So, Canada did not have a written entrenched constitutional document until 1982. Great Britain does not have a written constitution. Neither does New Zealand. Neither do Saudi Arabia and Israel. I'm not sure that I'd want to hold up Saudi Arabia as a particularly positive example of this. But for constitution, I think as Canadians we can understand constitution in a larger sense than most Americans would. So it's more than just a document, but it's the whole political culture in a sense. It's the whole complex of traditions that have shaped our political community over the course of many generations. So you can have a paper constitution that's perfect on paper, but it doesn't function well in reality because the traditions of that. The traditions of the real Constitution are not supportive of that particular document. So, and I think that's what in Canada we can probably understand that better than Americans can.
How so?
Well, because many of our constitutional issues have nothing to do with what's in our Constitution Acts.
Really?
Absolutely. The Prime Minister is not mentioned in either of our Constitution Acts. The Cabinet is not mentioned in our Constitution Acts. The Queen, the Governor General, the Queen's Privy Council for Canada, those are mentioned. But the central players in our political system are nowhere mentioned in our Constitution Acts.
So what are the implications of that?
Well, the implications of that are that we follow conventions of the Constitution. These are unwritten conventions, as it were, that are very important to the smooth functioning of our political system. So many of the constitutional issues that arise, for example, between the federal and the provincial governments, we do have sections 91 and 92, which lay out the respective jurisdictions of the federal and provincial governments. But very often the waters are muddy, and we have to rely on written conventions to guide us. And whatever constitution it looks like, whether we're talking about a written document or we're talking about the complex of traditions and conventions that regulate life in our political community, we're talking about constraints on governments. We're talking about limits on government. There was a 19th century Russian, don't know who said it, it's anonymous if you look on these quotation pages. He said, he said every country has its constitution, but ours, meaning the Russians, ours is absolutism moderated by assassination. If you have to go that far, if you have absolutism, and the only way you can you can limit an absolute government is by assassination, then something is obviously wrong. And so I think in our English-speaking democracies, we have had a very long tradition, going back many centuries, at least to 1215 in Magna Carta. Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, countries that have inherited a very strong constitutional tradition going back many centuries. And those are what put the limits on our political actors. And they can't be created out of nothing.
Fascinating. Yeah, no, because I guess what I was just thinking in regards to, of course, with the lockdowns and so forth, and especially in social justice issues, that there's always a call on the church to intervene in things that might be a political issue. So, for example, police brutality.
Yes.
Right. So police brutality is not a church issue. It's a state issue.
Yes, but if you read the postscript to my book, the second edition wasn't in the first edition, but this is something that I added specifically for the second edition. It's a concluding ecclesiological postscript about the role of the institutional church vis-a-vis political life. Now, I think a church as an institution has the responsibility to educate its members about what justice is and what justice demands. I don't think an ecclesiastical assembly, whether it's a synod or general assembly or whatever they call it, should be making a pronouncement on, say, the $15 per hour minimum wage, because I think that is something that needs to be. It's something that our actual office holders, public office holders, need to deliberate about, because that's more of a prudential judgment. Okay, what is a fair minimum wage, and what can we set it without impoverishing the workers or without exacerbating unemployment? And that's something that only economists are more likely to be able to tell us how to strike a balance than, say, an ecclesiastical assembly or a minister preaching from a pulpit. But on the other hand, a minister has a responsibility to if there's a police officer in his congregation who is brutalizing people on the streets, then that church has a responsibility to step in and discipline that member.
Yeah, it's such a an interesting dilemma, especially in today. When you started talking about the Constitution, I was thinking about the constitutional challenge that was made with regards to getting churches to reopen. Right. When you said some of the things aren't in our Constitution, it just instantly took me to, okay, so how do you really deliberate an issue that starts to become a constitutional challenge when there's no documentation? To some extent, you could argue, you go back to the common law sort of precedent approach. But if you have no precedent, it seems like we almost put ourselves in harder resolution. Like, whereas the U.S. Constitution sort of almost has a lot more, foundational challenge that you can make.
Much more of the American Constitution is codified. I think that's the way that we would put it.
So in one of your talks, and you brought it up briefly here, you sort of parked the idea of talking about anarchism. And I wondered if you wanted to sort of just give a perspective on it a little bit. One of the reasons I bring it up is I've mentioned it a couple times because I think there's a colloquial use of the word, and then there's the actual use of the word, what it's intended to mean. And the colloquial use is sort of used towards lawlessness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But in the word itself means the absence of a leader.
Yes, that's
the
right.
reason I want to bring that up is also there's this. I feel like culturally, especially within the Christian community, we take sort of Romans 13 and sort of use that to say, okay, we need to create government, as opposed to to some extent, I would argue that maybe there's an aspect where the Bible allows you to live without government if you somehow could do that. Because it's, not to say you don't have justice and the need to resolute, but this necessity to set it up. And so I just wondered if, some of those things you could talk through a bit.
Yeah, I think those are two. I'm seeing two subjects here, and I can talk about both or either if you want. We could go back to the pre-monarchical Israelites, living under the judges and so forth. And if you'll notice in the first 5 books of the Bible, I'm just reading through those right now. I'm at the book of Numbers in my evening prayers, and you'll notice that before the Israelites came into the land, they were to set up these cities of refuge, in which, if somebody is inadvertently kills somebody, commits manslaughter, we would call it nowadays, then they could hide in the cities of refuge against the avenger of blood. This is somebody who has been hired by the injured family, if you will, to go in and take out the person who killed the family member. There's the very chaotic time in Israel's history, and what does it say in the book of Judges? It says, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So I mean that's one thing I could talk about, but it's also true that in that chaos you had leaders that were, I can speak like Max Weber and talk about charismatic leaders, if you will, people who rose to the top simply through being able to persuade others that God had called them to protect them against their local enemies and so forth. And leaders nevertheless rise to the fore. I think something like political rule is intrinsic to human life in community. There is no such thing. The state, as we know it, is only maybe about 500 years old. But political authority is something that goes back almost to the beginning of humankind. And that's something that I think anarchists have difficulty recognizing. Now, let me be fair to anarchism, because anarchism does not mean chaos. And that's, as I think you're saying, this is the way most people take anarchism. Anarchism it assumes that people, without governing authorities, will be spontaneously cooperating with each other for common purposes. John Locke was not an anarchist, but he did believe that something like the laws of nature would hold for people, for the most part, even in a state of nature, but that there were certain inconveniences that people would want to try to transcend, and that's when they would set up a civil commonwealth. Anarchism assumes that people will spontaneously cooperate if the obstacles to their virtues are removed from them. Now, I don't myself hold to anarchism, but I want to be fair to anarchism as a set of political or maybe anti-political principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's something that people sort of make either a straw man argument of usually, and it's sort of dismissed outright without even really necessarily understanding the positions that are truly trying to be presented. So, I thought I think for me, the quote that a lot of aligns with what you've just said is like, if you think about most of our daily interactions, they would fall under what you would sort of think of as anarchist, right? There's no government intervention. Right. There's no people, moderating. How'd you go to lunch with that guy? Or, so there's sort of, I think, a disconnect between, what that ideology sort of is, and then what people sort of make it out to be. So,
see, but the problem is that we have a tendency to claim more than we have a right, and our communities claim more than they have a right, and that is the sort of thing that leads to conflict. Now, it may be that we can find a parallel in the international realm, because there is no world empire. There's no king of the world that can bring the nations of the world in tow, except for Jesus Christ himself. Mm-hmm. There's no United Nations is certainly not a supranational political authority. It's never really functioned that way. But nevertheless, most of the world's states are at peace with each other. And it's when there are wars, when they come to blows, that's what makes the news. So, international law, there is such a thing as international law, even though there's no higher authority to step in and enforce that. And mostly international law is enforced by nations themselves, either forming treaty relationships with each other. I think NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is almost far and away the most successful military alliance that has ever existed. It's outlasted its original reason. It's now, what is it now? It's 71 years old, and it's communism is gone. It now seems to exist to keep the peace within the territory that's covered by the NATO countries, and it seems to be doing a very good job of that. But still, even NATO is not a supranational authority. It's an interlocking treaty organization that holds members together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's good.
Yeah, and I think but like I would say I sort of associate with the more libertarian perspective, but the word
hold on. I thought you said you don't do labels, man.
I don't do labels. Like I say, I associate with that perspective, but the reason I was actually gonna go from there is this idea. I like to use the word voluntarism because it doesn't have sort of baggage. Why I want to bring that up is, to some extent, you're talking about relationships that are all voluntarily entered, and if one of the parties, like NATO, for example, decided they didn't want to be in there, that would be involuntary. There might be, let's say, contract dissolution agreements that sort of have to go along with it. But in essence, they're voluntarily maintaining these things. And
That's
think
right. On
it's
the
something
international level, that's true. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I'll say sometimes I feel like a lot of people who strive towards political solutions sort of discredit voluntary solutions as potentially being more effective.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think there's something to that. I think I would want to be careful about trying to extend the voluntary principle too far, because the most significant institutions in our society are not at base voluntary in nature, and that's the thing that I think libertarians will have trouble accounting for, at least if they stay true to their own principles, which they probably will not. And that's one of the things that maybe thinking about all of these ideologies that I talk about in my book. These are, as it were, the pure forms. So to find somebody who's a socialist, and those are the only political principles they follow, well, you're not going to find that. So if you go south of the border where you have Republicans and Democrats, well, both are carry forward varieties of liberalism. Both can be conservative in some sense. I venture to say that there are certain people in the Democratic Party that might even call themselves social democrats or democratic socialists, like Bernie Sanders, for example, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So in reality, most people are a mixture of various ideologies. They may tend to lean in one direction, but in my book I deal with them in their pure forms, as it were. But recognize that you're probably going to meet very few people that are socialists and are willing to run with their principles, to the nth degree, even at the expense of flesh and blood human beings.
Yeah, I've a lot of times said, I think for those that sort of tout socialism, they sort of don't really understand to some extent, because they don't. What does that mean from a property rights perspective? Are you really promoting removal of property rights? And if you are, do you understand what that means? So I think your point's pretty accurate, but they sort of still use those labels of the purest forms.
And for now, I mean, most socialists now, if you think about our own New Democratic Party, that's Canada's Socialist Party. It used to be called the Cooperative Commonwealth before 1961. For now, most socialists will simply say in somewhat vague terms that they're seeking greater economic equality. So communal ownership of property is in the interest of equality. They may still be suspicious of private property, but for the most part, they're going to limit themselves to saying, well, we want to have greater economic equality. And that means, putting more funding into the welfare state, universal health care, Canada Pension Plan, and so forth, social assistance, and the like.
Now, considering you taught at a Christian university at Redeemer for a while,
right?
I'm sure the issue of Romans 13, like Joel brought up previously, like how do you handle Romans 13? Because I'm sure your students bring it up to you.
Right. Romans 13, I think it's a passage that I think that we need to read. I think we need to read it very, very carefully as well. It's not a blanket. It's not a blanket permission for governments to do whatever they want to. If you read it very carefully, governments are supposed to serve, and that's one thing that really made an impression on me. When I was about 20 or 21 years old, I did a paper. I was attending a Christian university in Minnesota back in the mid-'70s, and I wrote a paper on a book that was treating Romans 13. And when I went back to the Greek, now I have to tell you that my father, his mother tongue was Greek. He grew up in the island of Cyprus and was a Greek speaking. So his mother tongue was modern Greek. So I learned modern Greek when I was a child, and then I sort of branched out from there to New Testament Greek as well. So I was looking at the passage, and I noticed that the words that are spoken of for the governing authorities, the powers that be, as the King James Version puts it, they're words like diakonos, which is the word from which our word deacon comes from. These are servants of God, liturgos, from which our word liturgy comes from, public service, if you will. This is your government performs a public service. In other words, far from giving a blanket allowance to tyrants. This is a statement of the normative function of what political authority is supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I think that's what I've sort of really found interesting around Romans 13, and I mean I might be reading it into it a little bit, but if you look at Romans 12, you look at the latter part of Romans 13, you look at Romans 14, so much of it is about like living, loving your neighbor, loving your brother, like living in community with people, and I see the role of the state in regards to to some extent wielding the sword to undo injustice, which obviously oversimplification, but I wonder how much people allow that to it's like I would think most Christians would say, okay, God's called to judge immorality or your sin, and that's going to happen in the day of judgment. But to some extent, it seems like there's this allowance to say, well, Romans 13 is also talking about regulating, sinful behavior that doesn't necessarily involve the violation of your neighbor. I'm wondering if you think that's, again, I sort of use the Pauline sandwich, which may or may not apply, of sort of what's right around that text.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah. Well, it is interesting because it says, I've just turned to it now. It says, chapter 12, verse 9. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. It also says, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Repay no one for evil. Live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. But then we find out that God has instituted an authority to exercise his wrath on those people who are committing unjust acts. And I see that Romans 13 following from Romans 12 in that sense. Not as individuals, we're not supposed to seek to avenge ourselves, but to recognize that there are political authorities that will, not so much avenge us, but as to ensure that we receive justice against those who would violate our property or our lives or our liberties.
And I have a second. I tend to think people's default towards Roman 13 is overly simplistic, so I tend to have a bit of let's say pushback options. The other one that I tend to like to say to people is, can we really read Romans 13 without taking into consideration what's in 1 Samuel 8? When Israel's getting their first king and some of the let's say detrimental things that are going to come as a result of it.
Of course. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I just wonder, how you're, from a theological perspective, you think there's, some substance to sort of that claim that I like to make.
I think if we take Scripture as a whole, we're going to see that that political authority is not, like anything else in the world, is not an unmixed blessing. But neither is it an unmixed curse either. So there's no perfection in this world. Governments are going to stumble in some way. Maybe it's true. Maybe in this current lockdown, maybe governments are overextending themselves. I mean, that's certainly a possibility. But if there are cases that arise from it and that are going to be fought through the courts, my guess is that the judgment will come after the emergency is over. Nowadays it's both in Canada and the United States, courts judged that the Roosevelt administration and the Mackenzie King government did wrong to put in camps, in internment camps, Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians. But you'll notice that judgment came after the war had ended. So it may be that if there's going to be any kind of rectification for what's happening right now, we may have to wait until the emergency has passed, whenever that happens.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we do see a little bit in the states where, I think some of the states have sort of said the governors, abuse their emergency powers. Some things are getting pulled back. I mean, it's not to the fullest extent, to your point. I think, there's only so much you can do in the midst of trying to navigate a scenario like this.
Right.
But for the most part, you only see sort of the small pieces of it. But again, it wasn't in March. It was in the middle of the summer when things have sort of started to calm down. So,
well, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, well, thank you, David, for coming on, and
Oh, you're
we
very
really
welcome.
appreciate your time. You've been very gracious with your time, so we really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Oh, I was happy to do so. It was good to get to know you and to talk to you.
Yeah, no, totally. And the book, Political Visions and Illusions: A Survey and Christian Critique of Contemporary Ideologies. Yes, very, very helpful book in regards to the way I see things, and me as an educator and a podcaster and all everything in between. It's been very helpful. So thank you for it.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Yeah, for our listener, if they want to maybe follow you on social media or reach out to you, what would be the way to do that?
Well, just look up my name, David Koyzis, Koyzis. There's no other person with that name on earth, and I'm all over the internet. I have a blog. It's called Notes from a Byzantine Right Calvinist. I'm also on Twitter. I'm on Instagram as well. LinkedIn. I'm fairly easy to find.
Okay, I'll make sure all that's in the show notes page too. So,
Okay,
and I'll
great.
probably give listeners access to both, or a link to both the first and second editions of your book, so they can also see the cover changes that you mentioned.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yes,
The smooth cover of the
I really like the new cover. I think it's great. Yeah,
Yes, I agree. It's much more appealing to some
it
extent.
is. Yeah.
It feels like you're getting a gift.
Yeah.
It feels like you're getting a gift.
It kind of freaked me out at the beginning when they showed me the cover, and then the more I looked at it, I thought, yeah, this is perfect. This is great. So
Yeah, no, but it's good because the book is called Political Visions and Illusions. So when you look at the book, it's kind of blurry.
It is, yeah.
Like the illusions is kind of blurry. So, are you really seeing what you're supposed to be seeing, or what?
yeah, that's right. No, I think it's a work of genius. I love it. Yeah.
That's good. That's good. Well, thank you again. And best wishes in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, take care.
Goodbye.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?